The Scottish Highlands, April 16th, 1746. Orders ring out in the boggy moorland. The red-coated infantrymen of the British Army's 4th Regiment fix bayonets, shivering with cold and fear as they wait for the enemy. But they don't have to wait long. It's hard to see through the cannon smoke and driving sleet, but they can hear the roar of thousands of voices coming closer. The Scottish rebels, the enemy. They burst from the misty cover, Highlanders, garbed in tartan, some wielding broadswords and shields, others with bayonets and muskets. They scream Gallic war cries as they rush toward the government troops. But the 4th Regiment's muskets are already loaded. Officers give the command, and soldiers blast a splintering volley of lead and smoke. The battle for Culloden is underway. This episode is brought to you by, well, you, our lovely patrons over at Patreon. To hear about how you can vote on history topics we make shows about, and some pretty neat new stuff in the EC merch store, please stay tuned until after the episode. 2 hours earlier, with the wind and sleet whistling across the moor, the two armies stood facing each other. They were within cannon range, but for the time being, nobody fired. Commanding one side was Charles Edward Stuart, prince of the deposed Jacobite line. Handsome, with an Italian accent courtesy of his birthplace in Rome, the Bonnie Prince had spent his life yearning to reclaim the throne taken from his grandfather, James Stuart, in 1688. That year, Protestant subjects in both Scotland and England, dissatisfied with James's Roman Catholicism and disregard for Parliament, had deposed him and invited his son-in-law, the Prince of Orange, to take the throne in his stead. James then went into exile as the new dynasty took control. Yet in 1745, at the age of 25, Bonnie Prince Charle almost reclaimed the throne his grandfather lost. Landing in the Scottish Highlands, he convinced a number of clans to join him in a march on London, and the Rebel Jacobite Army made it all the way through northern England before being forced to turn back. Now they returned to the Highlands to make their decisive stand. Now, while Charles's rebel army consisted mostly of Highland clansmen, this was no battle between England and Scotland, but rather a bitter civil war. The Jacobites supported Charles because his royal line were from fellow Roman Catholics and because they saw him as their rightful monarch. Some Highlanders fought out of loyalty to their clan chiefs, while others did so because they were ordered to and risked having their homes burned if they refused the call. But in addition, the Jacobite forces also included Lowland Scots, whose culture differed from the Highlanders, as well as Englishmen and Irishmen. In fact, there were even French regiments, since France was rooting for a Stuart victory. Opposing them, 500 meters across the moor, was the British Army, led by the corpulent Duke of Cumberland, the third son of the British King George II and a distant cousin of Charles. Cumberland had swore to crush the rebellion, thereby securing the crown for his family line. And the British Army under his command included a mixture of English and Scottish regiments, since the 1707 Act of Union had joined the two countries. These included the Royal Scots Regiment, the oldest in the British Army, and the Royal Scots Fusiliers. But it wasn't only Lowland Scottish regiments wearing red that day. Many Highland clans had chosen to back the British government against the Jacobites, with the Campbells among the most famous to have taken up arms against Charles. The Bonnie Prince had arranged his army in 2 lines, with the Highland clans in the front, and this was with good reason. For the Highland Charge, with its claymore broadswords, had caused the Redcoats to flee in almost every battle of the rebellion. Nevertheless, there was still grumbling among the ranks. See, the previous night, Charles had bungled a surprise attack, and his troops wandered into the dark, never finding the enemy. As a result, the Jacobites were now cold, hungry, and exhausted. Furthermore, the clans, steeped in pride and tradition, had quarreled over who should get the most prestigious spot in the battle line. Meanwhile, across the field, the British formed 3 lines, each consisting of a row of regiments with artillery. Cumberland placed his cavalry on the flanks and deployed his loyal Highlanders on the left behind a walled enclosure. Then, around 1 p.m., Jacobite cannons opened fire, and the government artillery responded, with the experienced British Royal Artillery crews quickly gaining the upper hand. For 15 minutes, cannonballs pummeled the Jacobites, scything off arms, legs, and heads, and mortars lobbed explosive shells into their ranks. Seeing no other option, Charles ordered the advance. The call of "Claymore! Claymore!" ran up and down the line, and the men began to move forward. But the boggy moorland was ill-suited to a sudden rush, and the Jacobites struggled through the unstable ground. The left flank failed to even reach the government lines, while the center veered to the right, where the soil was firmer. Thus, the center and right of the Jacobite formation entangled into one disorganized mass bearing down on the government's left flank. The two government regiments, totaling around 900 men, suddenly found themselves facing a rebel horde 2,500 strong. The Jacobites then paused their advance briefly to fire their muskets and pistols at the redcoats, and those armed with broadswords drew them while others fixed bayonets. Then they charged, appearing to the British 4th Regiment out of the haze of the battlefield. The 4th Regiment fired only a single volley, whereas the regiment next to it managed two, bullets ripping into the charging Scots. For a moment, the smoke hides the carnage. Officers bark to level their bayonets rather than reload. The front rank stands, presenting a wall of bristling steel, just as the Jacobites surge into view, leaping over the bodies of their kinsmen. Then, contact. The Jacobites crash into the red-coated ranks. Swords hack and bayonets stab. A Scottish captain runs a charging Jacobite through in his pike before he's cleaved in half by a poleaxe. And near that chaos, the regiment's colonel has his hand chopped off by a claymore. In this frenzy, the British regiment is overrun. Its flags waver and fall, their standard bearer is killed. Previously, the Highland charge has always caused the redcoats to run. But this time, something different happens. This time the British hold firm, but they cannot stem the tide. Rather than run, they instead die where they stand. And despite the musketry and cannon fire, the treacherous ground, and the stubborn British resistance, Jacobites rush through the gap they've carved. This breakthrough is short-lived, however, for instead of open ground, the Jacobites meet a second line of government infantry. 4 fresh regiments move up to corral them, and the rebels have nowhere to go. The British regulars, trained to fire 1 round every 20 seconds, pound methodical volleys into the disorganized clansmen. In just 5 minutes, the regiments unleashed thousands of bullets into the Jacobite charge. Meanwhile, Highlanders loyal to the British government also outflanked the Jacobites via a stone wall and add to the crossfire their bagpipes shrieking. The last hopes for a Stuart restoration are cut down amidst a volley of lead, crashing with the regularity of ocean waves. The Jacobites broke, and Cumberland unleashed his dragoons in pursuit. All across the field, the British advanced to secure their victory, with one British private, a survivor from the overrun 4th, recalling how every bayonet in his regiment was bloody and bent. In the aftermath, government soldiers killed Jacobite prisoners, as well as civilians caught up in the retreat in cold blood. And many who conducted these battlefield executions were fellow Scots, enacting revenge for old grudges. Though Charles Stuart himself fled before the battle's end. Escaping the field, he was smuggled across the Highlands and slipped back to mainland Europe. He spent the rest of his life there in exile, descending into alcoholism and depression. And in addition to those killed on the day of the battle, over 100 Jacobites were executed in the weeks after Culloden, and around 1,000 were transported to the colonies. Troops burned captured Jacobite flags before a cheering crowd in Edinburgh. The battle marking a major turning point for both Scotland and Britain as a whole. After Culloden, Parliament passed laws that banned bearing arms and traditional Highland dress. And while many of these were repealed in the following decades, they did hasten to the end of Highland clan culture, a fact that a number of Lowland Scots welcomed. But since the government's Highland regiments were still allowed to wear tartan and carry traditional weapons, Highland men then joined in droves as one of the only means of continuing their traditions. And with the threat of a Stuart restoration removed, a century of British Civil War finally ended. With its homeland now secure, and the government able to look outwards, it was now set to emerge as a dominant global power. But Scotland never forgot the Stuarts and the Bonnie Prince. By the early 1800s, with the threat of Stuart restoration long removed, Scotland, which had mostly rejected the Jacobites, began to romanticize Charles and his rebellion. Culloden became the subject of nostalgic songs, poems, and even cookie advertisements, and remembrances of it encouraged the reintroduction of the tartan and the development of clan patterns, now a staple of Scottish identity. A bloody day that both ended a dynasty and defined a nation. You know, one of the main reasons we're able to make extra history episodes like the one you just watched is thanks to the insane generosity of all of the fantastic folks like you who are patrons over on our Patreon. And if you'd like to join our Patreon community, not only would you be helping us create the content that you love, but you'll also have options like suggesting and voting on extra history topics that turn into actual episodes, which I'm still floored by all of your suggestions. They're so awesome to read every time we do the poll. You get access to our lovely official Discord, where It's just wholesome as heck and lots of great discussions happen. You get to view all of our shows early and snag some exclusive things like 4K wallpapers and some never before seen digital posters. Side note, shout out to the artists on those. Actually, shout out to all the artists all the time. They're killing it on everything we do, including this ad read. So please give them tons of props in the comments. Where was I? Oh, right. We really pride ourselves on trying to make sure your generosity is rewarded, so please go check out the tiers and see if any of that tickles your fancy. And actually, speaking of fancy tickling, that came out wrong. It sounded better in my head. We'll fix it in post. Zoe, please insert a smooth transition of me talking about our new merch in the EC store. Exactly, bud. And you know, since you just yes-anded me so perfectly there, I'd like to show off this amazing new shirt showing off you enjoying all of the topics we cover in Extra Credits. It is adorable, and I love the fact that my cat is a beautiful history, mythology, literature, and game design loving nerd now on all the clothing I can wear. Not to mention, we also do monthly pin votes, again, voted by the patrons, so you can snazz up a blazer or a backpack or a collar. And actually, the whole store itself just got a glow up. We got tons of stuff there we don't really talk about much. Plushies of Game and Zoe, other shirts, posters, coffee mug with Game's face on it. I'm actually drinking coffee out of one of those objects right now. I'll let you guess which one. So whether you'd like to help forge the future of Extra History on Patreon, want to join a awesome community, or just want some sweet swag that, again, I am so freaking proud of, please consider supporting our channel by visiting one or both of the links below. We would very much appreciate it. And if you've made it to this point of this ad read for ourselves, I don't know, I feel like you might be the kind of person who would enjoy all the sweet perks that comes along with that stuff. So please check it out. And if you do, dare I say you'll be joining the fantabulous ranks of the following folks: Skylar Holmes, Joseph Lame, Dominic Valenciana, Casey Mustia, Arclight Games, Angela Valenciana, and Ahmed Ziad Turk are fantastic patrons, and we thank them so much.